let's talk about the American worker, because we do have a great panel with us. Tamla Oates-Forney, she is with us. She's Senior Vice President and Chief People Officer at Waste Management. Jared Spataro, he is Corporate Vice President for Microsoft 365. And also with us is Rob Falzon. He is Vice Chairman of Prudential Financial. And as we mentioned, Prudential is sponsor of today's event. So let's get to it, because we have a lot to get over. We had a really spirited planning call. So let's talk about it. Guys, good morning. Nice to have you here. I do feel like I want to kind of set the stage with the big picture, first of all, because COVID has really, I think, upended everything in terms of workplaces, how we work, how we manage workers. And I do wonder, just to kick it off, is this going to be a moment in time when we look back 5 years from now and we're going to say this was a turning point for the American worker? And I do wonder, when we look back, we're going to say it was a good turning point or a bad turning point. And Rob, I want to kick it off with you. How do you see it, that big picture?
Yeah, very, very much the way you articulated the first part of that, Carol. So good morning to everyone. I think you're going to look back at this period of time and say it was an inflection point in how Americans work. I think you're seeing that in a pandemic environment, we've gone to largely a remote work mode, and that it's actually working quite well. And I think the carry forward to that is that as we think about the future of work post the pandemic, this remote capacity that we have is going to be implemented in a much broader and systematic way, I think, throughout companies. I think the other part of it is the pandemic in going remote has accelerated a lot of the, what we were discussing before around the future of work and the digitization of our economy and automation of a lot of things. And so there's been a huge acceleration of that. Now, whether that inflection point turns out to be one that's good for workers or bad for workers, I think is a little bit up for grabs. To date, it's been good. Productivity's up pretty significantly, or maintained, if not up, I guess I should say. And in part, that's because of the adoption of technology and the fact that the workers have gained the skills to apply the technology that we have. But in a remote environment, and as the technology continues to progress, whether workers can keep the skills and gain the new skills, I think, is the question mark. And I think we're already beginning to see at the edge some fraying of that, where they're not getting as much learning, they're not learning as much on the job. The survey shows all of this. And that's the concern, that if we want to have this to be a good inflection point for American workers, I think we need to look back at how we're doing with regard to ongoing training for those workers.
You gave me a lot of things that I want to drill down on: technology, as well as, just thinking about kind of this big picture. Tamla, come on in on this. Do you see it the same way as Rob does?
Absolutely. But here at Waste Management, I have the opportunity of managing a workforce that's bifurcated. So I have about 35,000 employees who never left. They were always working on the front line, servicing our customers. So again, we looked at how do we change the way they work to keep them safe, but they were not working remotely. They were on the front line. And then I had about 10,000 employees that we moved from working in the office to working from home. So we were able to look at both extremes. And what it showed to us, it's represented the art of what's really possible. And we've gained efficiency. We've also gained better interaction with each other and customer service. So I like to look at it as a glass half full. But to the panelist's earliest point, I think it's something that we're going to have to continue to monitor to determine how do we lead, manage, and teach differently to ensure we're able to capitalize on all the great things that we were able to experience during this pandemic.
So I want to bring Jared into the conversation, because I know you guys have been collecting a ton of data, and we're going to go through some of the data points at Microsoft. But broadly speaking, how do you guys see it? Are we at a big turning point? Is it going to be a good turning point or a bad turning point?
Industrial era and the beginning of the truly digital era. We have been digital for a long time, but it has been digital in part. And so now I think we're starting to see everything go digital. In many ways, the first wave of digitization that happened in business was kind of taking paperwork and turning it into ones and zeros. Now we see all work, all interactions being forced to this idea of becoming digital. Now to the point of, is it going to be good or bad? We think that depends on us. We've got some interesting data points that indicate that there definitely are challenges, but also silver linings. So as an example, in some surveys that we have done, we found that about 30% of people worldwide right now say that the pandemic has increased their sense of burnout at work. And that's a real concern for us. A third of remote workers, so folks who are now working remotely in their homes, are saying that the lack of separation between work and life is already negatively impacting their well-being. But at the same time, we're seeing people who are saying that they're excited about being able to have more flexibility in the workplace. 82% of managers say that they'd like to have more flexible work from home policies post-pandemic, and 71% of employees are saying that they'd also like to continue to work from home after the pandemic. So we tend to see it as, having challenges and silver linings. We think that how all this works out is kind of up to us, which is very exciting. We think we can band together and find the good and capitalize on it.
I want to talk more about burnout in a minute, but Rob, I know you guys at Prudential have also done some research, and you found that in your survey, aside from compensation, put that aside, the number one reason that would encourage American workers to stay at their current employer is flexibility. That's number one. So workers, like we said, some of this has certainly been out there in the employment psyche, but workers want to have options here, Rob.
Yeah, very much. And to the point Jared was just making, I think that, you have to separate employees' experience between the pandemic and remote. The experience of working remote has actually been quite positive. And that's the part I think that will carry forward. The pandemic has been awful. And it's only because we've been able to work remotely. But to Tamla's point, not all employees, but service sector and office employees have been able to work remotely. That's been able to balance out some of the stress that's been caused by the pandemic. And, our own survey showed that 70% of the people that we surveyed felt as if the remote work was relieving stress that was otherwise associated with the pandemic. Now you've sort of opened Pandora's box in that before this, in our own employee force, so I'll give you that statistic. 21% of our employees 21% of our employees before the pandemic were working either mostly or entirely remotely, so 3 or more days a week. In our surveys, 75% of our employees said that they would like post the pandemic to be working 3 or more days remotely. 92% said that they want to work 2 or more days remotely. And when you think about remote, I do think it has 2 dimensions to it. One is a locational dimension, but the other is a time dimension. So it's the flexibility to be able to balance your work lifestyle around the needs at home and still being able to deliver at the workplace and maintain productivity. So I think that both those elements are going to need to come into sort of what the workplace of the future looks like.
Tamla, you guys, I feel like you at your own home have kind of the ultimate example of somebody who's been working from home. Your husband's been working from home for 10 years, but you say that experience versus what he's going through during COVID, it's different.
Yeah, it's quite different because prior to the pandemic, he had the flexibility to go out and engage and do different things with people. And then during the pandemic, he was stuck at home with me. So life as he once knew it changed. So I think that once we get through the pandemic, and I'm optimistic that we will, that I think working remotely, not necessarily at home, but working remotely will be more enjoyable because things would have opened up and they'll have the opportunity to do different things. But it was different for him and for me because I'm used to being in the office all the time. And so spending 8 to 10 hours a day at home with your spouse and both of you working and staying at home that much, it tested a lot in terms of our love for each other, but we made it through. But yeah, I think it's going to change once things start to open up. And people will not only have the opportunity to work from home, but they'll be able to work from anywhere. And one of the things that we did at Waste Management during this process is constantly engaged employee sentiment, right? I think workers are going to have more of a voice in terms of how the workplace, and their schedules take shape. So I would just encourage companies to continue to pulse the employees as we go through this journey and evolution.
I do wonder for the American worker, and let me follow up with you, Tamla, because I think you have a bifurcated workforce. I've talked to employers who do, where some have back office operations. They could work from home or they can work from home remotely in the future. But you've also got people who have to be out in the field. Does that create tension, though, potentially in the American workforce going forward? Those who can accept jobs where that it gives them some flexibility, and there are those who cannot.
So what I would say, we're looking at providing flexibility for all employees. And what that looks like is dependent on the job. Flexibility in the office is different from flexibility if you're working on the front line and driving a garbage truck, right? And so, but what we're trying to do is honor the integrity of providing flexibility for all employees, but it may look different. And so we're looking at that across the entire enterprise. So we're trying to treat people equitable, But again, the application of equity is going to be different depending on their role, because we also have to serve our customers. So imagine a world without us, it would not be pretty, and the pandemic would be a lot worse.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
On one point on that flexibility point, flexibility also includes being able to get back into the office. What I think is interesting in the survey is, people don't necessarily want to, to Tamla's points, working wholly from home or wholly remotely is not necessarily the positive experience that they want. Hybrid type arrangements where people can get the benefits of culture engagement, ideation, planning, the things that we come together for in the workplace. I think there's a desire amongst people to do that. The question becomes, what's the balance between that and remote?
Jared, it's interesting because Microsoft plans to let workers basically work remotely even after COVID, and we're increasingly seeing more companies do that. What's the thinking? What's some of the conversations that you guys are having at Microsoft about that? The upside to it, maybe the downside to it.
Yeah, for sure. We've announced a policy that said even post-pandemic that our folks can work up to 50% of their time remotely without even having to consult their manager. They can do even more if they work with their manager, but that's kind of like the blanket statement that we've made. If I take a step back for a moment, I think we've hit some great things. We've hit flexibility in terms of work time. We've hit flexibility in terms of work location. What we're seeing right now is that this idea of working remotely can also enhance our ability to draw talent in. Up to this point at Microsoft, there was a large gravitational pull that brought people here to the Pacific Northwest. Not everyone wants to move to Seattle. And we've already started to see our flexibilities opening up our pool to be able to reach out to workers. And we're really excited about that. That's an upside. The downside then becomes, up to this point, we feel like American businesses have historically used location as the way to create culture, social capital, to bond teams together, to create a lot of what made a business tick. That was all dependent on location. So what we're seeing already, as I go out and talk to customers all across the world, is customers are saying, hey, we're absolutely going to actually reduce our square footage. I'm hearing that across industries and in fact, across continents. We're going to reduce it because we think the future of work requires less square footage of office space. And we're going to end up using that office space very differently. It used to be, for instance, pre-pandemic, when you joined a company, they'd sit you down in a space and say, here it is. We expect you to show up here every day. This is where you get your work done. And just recently, I was talking to a customer, big, large manufacturing customer in the United States. I asked them, what's changing about work for you? And they said, we are realizing that work is no longer a place. It is the value you provide for our company. That was a huge change in their mindset. And that translates into recognizing that we're going to start issuing people not physical workspaces, but cloud-based digital workspaces. And they're going to be able to use those at home. They're going to use those in the office, and they're going to use those everywhere in between. That's a really big shift in how we think about what work is and how it happens.
So I wasn't going to go there, but let's jump in because Tamla, on our planning call, you brought up this whole idea of then what happens to company culture. I mean, we've had a lot of conversations. Bloomberg has a very distinct culture. It's a little frenetic, high energy, people kind of running into each other. It's really quiet here right now. It's a very different place. What happens to company culture, though, when we have this flexibility?
I think that is going to be the biggest challenge with this pandemic is how do you maintain your cultural connection while being socially distant? And I think the thing that we are going to be focusing on is telling the story of our culture through our employees. And so employees will still have experiences. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon us to highlight those experiences that help underscore and further accelerate who we are as a company and our culture. So I think we're going to have to be more intentional about that. The other thing I would say, I think the hybrid model for us is going to be very important because we do want people to come in for culture connections, if you will, and also for training. And I think we have to be deliberate about that. We're also going to have to be deliberate with our managers and leaders in terms of how they lead, how they engage, and how they motivate differently with either a bifurcated workforce or remote workforce. And so there's going to be a lot of leadership lessons and training that we're going to have to go through to make sure that what's so special about this company remains. And it's very relationship oriented. And it's hard to establish relationships when you're working remotely. So again, we want to be intentional about making sure we maintain the culture and telling the story of our culture through the examples of how our employees are living and working every single day.
I was talking to yeah, go ahead. No, come on in.
Do you mind if I jump in on that one? What I'm seeing around the world as I talk to customers is that this is top of mind. culture and social capital and training. They're wondering, like, how do we do this? And what I would say is that we are already starting to see a trend where spend that was very location based on employees, so meaning workspaces as an example, trainings, those types of things, they're moving from what I call analog, so location or proximity based, to digital. And this is going to be a major trend, I think, in the American workforce, is how that analog spend shifts to digital spend. And it's really important, I think, for business leaders and even for workers to really consider, oh, I see, I'm never going to be able to get back in the office with everyone on my team at the same time like I used to in January of 2020. That just isn't going to happen again. If that's the case, how do I invest? What do I need to buy, purchase, put in place to keep that culture? Because I look across here and I think, yeah, of course, culture is what makes a company and differentiates it. And that's a big shift that we're seeing right now.
Rob, what are your thoughts in terms of company culture and what happens as a result of all of this?
Yeah, culture isn't defined solely by the office space. I want to make sure that's important. It's, that is a dimension of it, how we interact with each other, relationships that we develop. And frankly, the strength of those relationships is what's allowed many companies to be so effective in a remote environment, because they've established working relationships that can sustain in a remote environment. But culture goes well beyond the office experience. I think about culture, it's defined by the relationship that companies have with their customers. It's defined by the relationship that companies have with their employees, and it's defined by the relationships that they have with their communities as well. And with respect to the relationship with the employee, a component of that absolutely happens at the office place, historically has, and will continue. But a big piece of that are the kind of investments that you make in your people. And the benefits and the care that you provide. And so having, paying people well and giving them benefit packages that provide the kind of security that they need in times like we've got now, that helps define culture as well. And what we found actually in our surveys, both internally and externally, is that culture took a jump immediately into the pandemic. And you sort of scratch your head and say, why? And in fact, not even immediately, but our most recent survey, culture scores went up. And the reason for that is what employees are witnessing is how their companies are responding to this pandemic, how they're taking care of their employees, how they're taking care of their customers, and how they're engaging with their communities to help as well. And those are all factors that help define culture as well. Now, these are things that are important to sustain, and the engagement with employees has to go beyond, helping them through the pandemic to now pivoting to, we have to help you post the pandemic to have the skills that are going to be appropriate. And to Jared's point, that digitization of your learning experience is absolutely going to be a part of the future, but it goes beyond that. That's just the tip of the spear. You have to think very differently about how you train and evaluate and develop your employees, and shift from this old model of, we think about experiences and resumes of experiences to one where we think about skills and resumes of skills, and how do we map those skills to the jobs and the opportunities that we have in the future. And that's sort of a higher level of application of our artificial intelligence, something we've been investing a lot in. We've created something we call the accelerator to do just that. You take your resume of experiences and it diagnoses it and puts it into a resume of skills that can then map to open positions that we have in the company. That will help sustain culture, because that's about helping your people to develop and successfully move on in their careers.
Recently launched, I think it's something called Gigs, right? And it's kind of that whole idea of employee development. There we go. We got your audio.
Fantastic. So yes, I was going to comment on a couple of things. One, in terms of, how we show up in times like these. And, when the pandemic first happened at Waste Management, one of the things we did to underscore what was said is we protected not only the physical security of our employees, but the financial security. So we guaranteed pay during the pandemic. So that was one thing. And then we tested a couple of different things. So to your point, we launched a gig program in the people organization, whereby we had people practice different things, focus on different projects, learn different skills, work with each other. And that has proven to be very beneficial, both in terms of development, but also as a surge resource, and something that we're going to leverage across the enterprise, because it's paid dividends, if you will, in terms of engagement in a virtual world, development in a virtual world, but also getting things done. And again, during this pandemic, we've been able to test a lot of things, and it's really represented the art of what's possible, things that we're going to take into the next year.
I mean, this is really important because it is important that employees are able to learn new skills, move on, move up in terms of the corporate ladder. But it's also about, and I think, Rob, you might have brought this up on our call, it's about, American workers staying competitive in a global marketplace.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we've got. We had that challenge coming into the pandemic. I think in an ironic sort of way, helped to a certain extent in the acceleration of skilling and adoption, as we've talked about, of digitizing our processes. But coming out of the pandemic, we've got that same challenge in front of us. As we've got this gap between the skills that many of our American workers have today and the skills that they're going to need to compete for the jobs that are required tomorrow. And those jobs that are required are the ones that will allow us to be competitive on a national and international platform. I think it's the optimal outcome here is one where you're able to fully deploy your talent. I mean, you sort of think about the equations to economic output, right? It's around labor and it's around capital, and if we don't fully utilize our labor, we're not going to be competitive on a global scale. And so we need to invest in talent, invest in labor to give them the skills that they need for the jobs of the future. But there's a gap today, and we need to be addressing that gap.
Yeah, and it's something then in a following conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about how do we kind of upskill a lot of workers that have been left behind. We're going to do that with the president of the Philadelphia Fed, Pat Harker. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that in just a moment. One thing I want to ask you, Jared, what are your thoughts in terms of making sure workers are staying, your Microsoft workers are staying, have the right skills, they're able to advance, they're able to kind of move around in this era where everybody's working from home?
Well, certainly the pandemic has accelerated a lot of trends we saw pre-pandemic. One of those has been the digitization of skills required to do jobs. And I would point out here, sometimes we think about that just simply as information worker jobs, meaning you go into an office, and that's not true at all. We actually see people who work on the front lines and are representing their company in all sorts of different ways, whether they're driving a garbage truck or they're, creating, an experience for someone who visits a restaurant. We think all of these jobs are going to increasingly be more digital over time. And as we look at the opportunity here, we also see that employers and the spend that they have been putting towards this training has stagnated over the last 2 decades. That's really important to recognize. So we've got an issue here. The skills demand is going up. The investment from employers isn't really keeping pace. So we partnered with LinkedIn. And we think it's important that we all kind of do our part in the economy. And just this summer, we announced a program where we're targeting 25 million workers globally to try and help them skill up. We've used the LinkedIn economic graph to try and help people understand where the demand is growing, what types of jobs are seeing increased demand. And then we're providing online training that they can use to skill up and actually get certifications. And I'd say, there's a lot happening. If you read in the Wall Street Journal this morning, there's a couple of articles about this idea are we starting to see the end of the relevance of the 4-year degree? I think that we're just in the moment when we're starting to see an explosion of opportunities for learning and skilling that's going to change the face of how people educate themselves and stay educated. So we're really excited both about the LinkedIn program and just about the way this is going to change the options for people.
Hey, I want to bring in one audience question, if I may. Linda asking, can you give specific ideas you plan to institute to engage your staff and maintain culture? And I do think we're all trying to kind of figure out, we've done the Zoom cocktail hours, we've done a lot of different things. Rob, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I presume the question relates to what you'd be doing in a remote environment. Obviously, there are lots of things we can do once we get to the other end of this pandemic.
Right.
Maybe with the recent announcements, that'll be sooner than many of us were thinking before. But yeah, what we find is actually what it really requires is just a higher level of personal engagement. Unfortunately, that means longer days for many people. I know in my own daily planning, I have a lot of time that's budgeted to one-on-one reach outs with individuals, and then what I call hallway conversations, so a dozen or so people at a time. And you need to make the investment in that. So the communication, I think Tamla mentioned earlier, or someone was mentioning that, the communication is so key to sort of building culture and maintaining it, and particularly in this environment. And I think that's the single greatest thing that you can do. It's about constantly messaging and checking in, because people are experiencing, many of the things that they're experiencing are not going to show up in the workplace dynamic. It's going to show up in a one-on-one conversation. And that's a difficult thing to do. It puts a lot of stress on managers, and we see that in our surveys, but it's a necessary thing for us to be doing during this pandemic. in order to be able to ensure that the health of the employee is there. Now, there are other things that you can do that are important, and it gets to be around the benefits that you're providing. And it's the flexibility of, if you've got getting with your kids at a certain point in the day, no meetings during that part of the day, and that's okay. It's around providing healthcare coverage for whatever level of support you need in face of testing or results from the pandemic. It's around childcare support. So I think there are benefits you can provide your employees that will help from a culture, but the single greatest thing you can do is be communicating with them and making sure you're staying in touch with where their stress points are, so that you can try to alleviate those either on a programmatic basis or an individual basis as you become aware of them.
If I could comment on that.
Please.
So a couple things that we did, and I think it's been very beneficial to us, and we launched this during the pandemic. So we have now an app called WM Now. So we push out a lot of information, so everybody's on their smartphone, so they get a lot of information. And I know it's not in person, but it's real-time information. During the pandemic, the leadership team, up to and including our CEO, we were out with messaging pretty much every single day, and then it went to weekly. So the constant communication. And something that I started prior to the pandemic, but paid dividends during the pandemic, is a weekly Tea with Tamla call that I host with all 400 or 500 of my people team members. And that has been really, really effective. We started it before the pandemic, and it kept us engaged during the pandemic. And so even though we're in this virtual world, I would like to think that leaders are able to reach even more people virtually than they are in a hallway conversation. Not that the virtual conversations negate the hallway conversations, but I think I now am able to reach 500 people versus maybe 20 people in Houston. And you just have to be intentional. You have to make the time to do it. It has to be an engaging platform where you're not just talking to your employees, but you're engaging with them and allowing them to have input in terms of what is taking shape. And that's proven to be very beneficial, but it has been intentional. It's been a focused effort and something that's been consistent and ongoing. And I think that's what leaders have to focus on. You have to make time for your people because it could be very beneficial.
I kind of have a hot button question and I want to get to it. Angel wants to know, what's the opinion on Deutsche Bank's suggestion of a 5% tax for remote working? Anybody have some thoughts on that?
I have some thoughts on that. Of course, the tech guy does. I think you're going to see very difficult to maintain. I don't think it's a great idea. I think it's going to be difficult to maintain because this idea of flexible remote work is going to become a perk of a job that's going to pull talent. We see that in our industry already. I think tech is a little bit of a leading indicator. If you don't keep up, that's fine. That'll be your choice as a business, but you will not be able to compete for talent in the same way. We see that war playing out in tech right now. And so I would just say you have to be really careful taking away flexibility that other people are going to use as options.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jared. I think the idea that some way or another, an employee has to bear the cost of being remote or should get paid less because while the employer is in Silicon Valley, but they're living in Arizona or something where it's a lower cost, and you think you can therefore pay them less for that. I don't think that's how markets work, and I think that's probably not sustainable, and you're clearly not going to be a magnet for talent to the extent you take those approaches.
Hey, one thing I want to ask you all. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to come in? Go ahead, Tamla.
No, I was going to say ditto on everything they said. This should not be punitive. It should be something that's a progressive move for all companies. So I completely agree with my colleagues.
One thing I want to ask you that I think is really important in terms of what the future of American workers, what it looks like, especially as you all seem to be kind of on board that we're going to see this hybrid environment. We're going to see more remote working. But I do wonder about burnout and technology. Jared, you guys at Microsoft had a stat. I think it was one day in March, you had a new daily record of not you, but I think you did a survey of 2.7 billion meeting minutes in one day. It was a 200% increase from 900 million on March 16th. This was basically, surveying people on your work, on your platforms. You're also seeing people, it's up 200% on weekends. So people are working at all different times. In Silicon Valley, they do that. If people want to work on the weekends, I've been to, Pixar, and people go out and play ball for a while and then they work at 1 a.m. There's a lot of flexibility. But how do we, Jared, let me start with you. How do we make sure we don't have burnout among our employees, especially if we increasingly are working remote and that the lines between work, and your home life are kind of fuzzy?
Oh, it is a top of mind for all of us right now, just to build on some of those stats, we have seen 55% more meetings and calls on our platform than pre-pandemic. So like literally 55% more of these interactions you didn't have previously. And then we've seen weekend work go up 200% as we track the telemetry. So that's not survey data. That's us watching in aggregate form. People use what we call Microsoft Teams, and we collect those signals and are able to kind of see broadly what's going on. You know, we have kind of an interesting set of research that we've been trying to do. And one of the things based on that research that we've done might seem a little counterintuitive. We've actually reintroduced the commute. What I mean by that is we did some work within one of our labs to test this idea of using a bot that would help you ramp up into your day, kind of a virtual commute, and then ramp down out of your day by asking you questions. You know, what are you going to get done this today? Are you ready? Do you have things all in order? You know, what did you get done? What's tomorrow going to be focused on? Even though that sounds funny, you know, this virtual commute, what the research is telling us as we go out and kind of combine that telemetry with us actually watching how people work, is that things like a commute, buffers that help you get into your workday, then create some space and get out of your workday, actually improve productivity. In that particular study, for instance, we found that 61% of the people felt like they were instantly more productive with this virtual commute. And on average, productivity for them went up between 12 and 15%. So it wasn't just a couple of percentage points. So we feel like we should follow the science here when it comes to burnout and what we can do. And we're just doing our best to be students of the moment and to recognize, yes, burnout is a real thing. It's happening. Largely it's happening because people's schedules have been upended. We've got to help them create kind of new ways of compartmentalizing the work that they do, because it turns out working more hours doesn't mean you'll be more productive. So a little bit counterintuitive. Let's reintroduce the commute. That's one of the things we're up to.
Yeah, Carol, can I jump in on that?
Please.
Yeah, so our survey showed that on average, people were commuting an hour a day that saved time, and also showed that about 60% of that they reinvested into a longer workday. And so the harvesting of the commute has not been to their personal benefit, but rather to working longer. The other statistic, I forget exactly what it is, well over half of the people surveyed are saying that to Jared's point, the boundaries of the day, the beginning and the end, have evaporated. And so, the commute used to be the way you marked sort of the beginning of the day and the end of the day, and it's not there. So I think there are interesting ideas about what you do, but that's one of the things I think the answer can't simply be more digital engagement, because that only heightens the stress. I don't know about you guys, but at the end of the day, I'm tired of seeing all of you on the screen.
I'm tired of this. I'm tired of this.
I know.
Is a virtual cocktail hour, because I just want to be off the screen at the end of the day. Yeah. I really do. And so those are the kind of things I don't think work. Now, mandatory no meetings during lunch, mandatory Fridays, no meetings, mandatory, no meetings before a certain hour. I think we need to help employees reestablish boundaries to the day when you're in a virtual environment. And I think the communication clearly is the first and most important thing you can be doing, but you also have to help people, because the reality is they're not being successful at managing on their own, and we need to give them tools and actually guidelines that can help them to be more successful.
Just one thing to put a pin in this, I would say, is as leaders, we have to role model the behavior we want to see. So if we're saying that you need to take more time off and you need to do these things, we need to be able to role model it. They need to see it in us, because if they can see it in us, then they know that it's acceptable. And then I think that we also have to be in tune to how our employees are showing up, right? So when we see that they are burning out, that they haven't taken vacation, as leaders, it's incumbent upon us to recognize that and encourage them to do that. But I think role modeling the behavior that we expect from our employees is the best thing that we can do as a leader.
Excellent.
All right,
point.
we're gonna wrap it up. I just want you guys to finish this thought for me. Jared, start with it. The fate of the American worker is what?
Based on our ability to be adaptable, I would say it is adaptability. If I could put one word to it, we're going to have to recognize there are awesome opportunities, certainly challenges, awesome opportunities that are ours for the taking. I have great confidence in the American worker, because that's what we do as a nation. We are adaptable, and that's what I hope to be here.
All right, Tamla, the fate of the American worker is?
In our hands.
It's
nice. In our hands.
Short and sweet. And Rob, why don't you wrap it up? How do you?
It's the fate of the American worker is actually a good fate. When we look at We've had lots of histories of transition, of industrial revolutions, right? We're in the fourth, fifth, whatever, know how you want to label these things. There's been disruption during that transitional period every time. But every time at the end of it, workers come out being more productive, and the economy winds up being better off, and society winds up being better off. So we'll get to the other end of this. We just need to make it a better transitional experience than what we've seen in the past in other industrial revolutions.